This episode of Shadiversity is brought to you by the tremendous support of my patrons from Patreon. Truly, if it wasn't for them, I wouldn't be able to make such high production videos which take so much longer time to produce, like this one which you're about to watch. If you would like to support Shadiversity, please visit patreon.com/Shadiversity. There's a link in the description below.
Shadiversity.
Greetings, I'm Shad, and as a massive medieval enthusiast, I love castles. And as a result of that, I love looking at fictional castles and comparing them to their historical counterparts to see how realistic they really are, and also how effective they would be at fulfilling one of the more crucial roles that a castle was meant to fulfill, defending its occupants. It is a military structure, as well as the other roles castles filled as well, because they also served as palaces, centers of government and homes as well. And in this video, I'll be looking at probably the most iconic fictional fantasy castle ever made. The Disney Castle. This is really the granddaddy, and it's also the most iconic by far. Whenever people think of a fantasy castle, it is the Disney Castle that many people kind of look to as a template and inspiration. But what's really interesting about this is that the Disney Castle itself took very strong inspiration from real castles that actually exist, and I'll point those out as we go through this video. One of the things that's interesting about trying to analyze the Disney Castle that you might not be fully aware of is that there's actually more than one. At the moment, there are three types of castles that the castles within the Disney theme parks are designed around, that being the Sleeping Beauty Castle, the Cinderella Castle, and there's even a new castle in the Disney Shanghai theme park. Yet each one of these castles in and of themselves are actually different to what I would have to say is the true Disney Castle, which is the glorious, huge one that we see in the Disney logo introduction to their movies. This is by far the biggest, the most iconic, and the most official Disney castle out of the many differing Disney castles. And in identifying this as the true Disney castle, I kind of run into a bit of a problem and limitation, and it's that there's not many shots or images of this castle from differing angles. It's only the same kind of panning angle that we have in the introductions to their movies. Now, in analysing this picture that we have right here, we can figure out the layout and overall design of the castle, but that takes a bit of study, and I don't want to have to force you guys, my viewers, to try and picture it as I pick out things individually. So to do this review properly, I have had to prepare something special. That same type of thing that I had to prepare for my review of the Hogwarts Castle from the Harry Potter film series. And yes, indeed, I have made a full 3D model of the Disney Castle so we can see it from every angle, and I can show to you what the layout really is from studying this picture in detail. I made this in the 3D modeling program SketchUp. There's a free version of this program called SketchUp Make that you can download without paying a cent. And if you do that, I've uploaded this very model to the SketchUp warehouse so you can download it and take a look at it in detail at your leisure. Just a little kind of bonus present that I've made for anyone who is interested. It was really fun making this model, and I tell you what, I learned a lot of interesting things about the Disney Castle's design in making it. Things that you can figure out by studying this picture, working out what the castle's layout must be, but that are not overtly obvious just by looking at it. Of course, one of the first things that I needed to do to make this model was to scale this image to the right size, and I was able to do that by measuring off the crenellations, because on real castles, these crenellations, and it gets very pixelated when you get close, should be head height to a regular human. And so if we grab a regular sized person and measure them up, we get the accurate scale, especially with these battlements here. Even though it's very pixelated, you can see the individual crenelles between the merlons with the roof covering, which then gives us an approximate height of this castle when measuring it off a regular sized person. And so then I base the scale of my model off this image accordingly, and we get the Disney Castle. So the first thing to address is the question of how historically authentic is this castle's design? And the answer is, it's actually more historically authentic than you might think. The design and finer details in regards to its overall aesthetic can be traced back to late medieval / early Renaissance French castle design. A very unhistorical element about the Disney castle is its sheer size. In regards to the scales of historical castles, the Disney castle is massive. But that statement does need to be understood in context. It's not massive in terms of its surface area. In fact, there are real historical castles that encompass a much larger surface area than what the Disney castle does, but in regards to the size of its main primary buildings, well, those are huge. Here is the Disney castle, and now compare it to one of the larger historical keeps that still exist today, specifically the White Tower. Yet if you were to take the White Tower and include the external buildings and its external walls, its surface area actually ends up looking to be at least comparable than the Disney castle's surface area. And another interesting thing about the Disney castles, its outer walls are actually not overly sized in scale. They are at a reasonable size in regards to historical castles. It's those internal buildings and how huge and tall they become, especially the towers. Because my model was made in a 1:1 scale, I can actually take accurate measurements from it. From the tip to the base, the tallest tower stands at 148 meters. And just to let you know, that is over twice the height of the tallest castle from the Disney theme park, that being the one in Shanghai. But those castles look massive. How do they look so massive when in actual fact, the tallest one is only 60 meters high? Well, I'll explain that in a follow-up video. Please keep an eye out for it, and once it is out, I'll link to it right here. So the theme park castles are nowhere near as tall as the official Disney castle as shown in their logo introduction to their movies. That one is exceptionally big. Does this make the Disney castle unrealistic? Not necessarily. It makes it unhistorical in terms of scales and sizes, but regarding overall size, the Disney castle isn't actually outside of the realms of possibility in terms of what humans have been able to build. In fact, have a look at the Disney castle's size compared to the Empire State Building. And remember, I've scaled this as accurately as I could going off direct references. It is dwarfed in comparison, and with that comparison in mind, the Disney castle size isn't actually that unrealistic. Old St. Paul's Cathedral, which was completed in the year 1240 and has since burnt down and been rebuilt, which is also one of the tallest structures built before the 20th century. But the highest point of the original version reached 150 meters. That is actually taller than the Disney castle. And so clearly structures this tall could be built within the medieval period when given enough motivation and resources. It is just that historical castles were rarely ever that tall, mainly due to practicality. There was no need to build them that tall, but that doesn't mean they didn't possess the technology or ability to do it. Now previously I mentioned that a lot of the finer elements of the Disney castle's design style are based off late French style medieval castles / early Renaissance, and this is very much true. Have a look at Castle Pierrefonds. This is the best representation of late French style castles that still stand and exist today. In fact, this castle is actually used as the main castle backdrop to the Merlin TV series. It represented Camelot. You have to understand, not all medieval castles look like this at all. No, this is very much late medieval, early Renaissance. Even though the current version of Pierrefonds was actually rebuilt well after the medieval period, it is very much based on authentic late French medieval castle design, as we can see from these other references. And now compare the similarities between this design style and the Disney castles, specifically the outer walls and towers. We see the same kind of doubling up of crenellations or battlements on the top towers. You have the outer ring followed by a more internal ring that's offset and a little bit smaller than the outer circumference. You see it on Pierrefonds and you see it on the Disney castle. Also have a look at the battlements on the outer walls. The crenellations are essentially roofed off to the point that the crenellations don't actually look like crenelles and merlons, but squares or square windows placed in succession to one another with a roof over top. But that's just the result of what crenellations would look like with a roof, and so these are still effective battlements. And so even though the smaller details and overall layout of the battlements are quite historical, one of the things that are not historical are the number of buildings that are all clumped kind of closely together behind the outer wall. Most historical castles only had 1 to 2 primary defensible buildings, and the other buildings were generally smaller structures within the bailey, whether that was the blacksmith, the stables, a barracks, or a chapel. Indeed, in studying what gives is a fantasy castle, the look of a fantasy castle, I have found out it's actually the number of individual buildings behind the outer walls. A castle seems far more historically authentic when you have one primary keep and an outer wall with maybe a couple of other buildings, compared to when you have many different castle buildings within the external walls, especially when those buildings are of a different kind of design, shape, and size to one another. Of course, there are exceptions to this historically, and indeed these types of castles that have many different kind of buildings of different sizes and shapes and heights certainly look far more fantasy-like than castles with fewer buildings constituting their overall layout. But still, fantasy castles generally take that concept and ramp it up in size, scale, and number. How effective would the Disney castle be in really what is the most authentic and primary purpose of an actual historical castle, that being defending its occupants inside and repelling attackers? The Disney castle has some really positive elements in regards to this, as well as some pretty large weaknesses. One of the really odd things about its design, if we were to analyze it from a functional perspective, can this castle be a real castle, is that its entrance is on a river and lake. I mean, the front gate, the portcullis, opens onto a river. This means anyone trying to get through the front door needs to get into the castle via boat. And it's a unique thing to consider, having a main gate open onto a river. No battering ram could get to the main gate as a result of that. You're not gonna rip open the portcullis. You'd sink, you'd drown. You'd have to fill it in somehow, which would be a huge pain. All the while, the defenders are able to shoot down at you while you're trying to fill in this river. It's hard to see if the river extends all the way around the castle. Logically and practically you would expect it would, but I cannot confirm if the moat extends all the way along the castle, only that the river runs right through its guts. And if it does not extend on the sides of the castle creating a moat, that is a massive missed opportunity, and it would be a huge blunder on whoever designed this castle. Yet with a moat, which would be so easily added because there's a river already there, that would increase this castle's defensive ability massively. The other odd thing regarding the Disney castle is that there looks to be two small bridges extending on either side. And they are kind of external elements to the castles, but they do indicate two side posterns or entrances to the castle, which is a small door somewhere on the outside of the castle, only large enough for a single person to move through one at a time. They're very easy to defend because of that. Posterns are not necessarily weaknesses. They can be if they are open from the inside to the enemy. I've never come across a historical example where a postern was opened by force. The next thing that we need to look at in assessing the Disney castle's defensibility is its actual layout, which we can infer through study from the images that we can see, but that is not directly obvious. So with this 3D model, I can now show you what its top layout actually is. And so going to a bird's eye view, it's actually very interesting. And you might not be able to see it right away because of the internal buildings that fill up this castle's bailey. If you have a look at the image that we are referencing, you will see little buildings poking up just a little bit behind the external wall, indicating that the bailey is actually filled up with internal buildings. And so these external buildings could constitute the homes of the servants that work in the castle, leaving all the grand guest rooms and ballrooms and dining halls and throne rooms that you would expect to find in a castle this grand and not be filled up with servants' quarters. And just like historical castles, they often had buildings sitting within their internal baileys. Generally not to the extent that we see here on the Disney castle. There's not much space in between, and we don't really see an open courtyard as a result. But if we were to remove those internal buildings, have a look at the castle's defensive layout. We see a wall within a wall. This is very historically authentic. This means that the Disney castle is actually a concentric castle, a very authentic historical design, and a profoundly defensible one. In fact, some people have claimed that the concentric castle is the most effective and defensible design historically. The secondary wall sits higher in elevation to the external wall. This is a very important element to a concentric castle because it means the defenders who are standing standing on the secondary wall can still fire down at people attacking the first wall. It doubles up the offensive capacity of a castle. The major thing that undermines this design are all those internal buildings, because if the enemy ever does breach the external walls, well, look at all the buildings that they have room to cover and, hunker down in. All these internal buildings actually constitute a fairly large defensive weakness. If they were removed and it was just kept as open courtyard, the castle would fare much better during a siege. A very impressive defensive feature with the design of the Disney castle's walls is that there is a double line of battlements. You have the roofed off battlements that look like square windows running along the wall that are supported by corbelling underneath, and then on top of those, set back just a little bit, you have more classical style crenellations. This wall essentially has two ramparts. In fact, the secondary wall has this same design feature, enabling 4 lines of defense on its 2 defensive walls. That is some serious fortifications, and the Disney castle, this fantasy family-friendly castle, is actually far more deadly than I originally thought. Now let's have a look at the buildings that sit inside the secondary wall. There is a clear and identifiable primary keep, as well as a really large donjon sitting next to it, and then it has other kind of secondary keeps all around, giving us the fantasy aesthetic that I explained before. There are not many battlements on these buildings at all. They are basically here just to look really impressive. Now, of course, castles were made to look impressive, but not having any fortifications on them, that's a defensive weakness. We see some fortifications on this wall that's sitting above and a little bit behind the secondary wall, so this would be like a 3rd line of defense, yet it's only sitting on one side of the castle, yet still these are proper battlements in the late French medieval castle style. Problem with it is that these battlements are not reproduced on the other side, making the right side of the castle more vulnerable than the left. One of the more beautiful design principles that we see employed all over this castle is the extension of the upper walkways and parapets of the castle walls and towers. See how they hang over the line of the walls underneath? My viewers will be very aware of what I'm referring to here. Historically, this extension has a name which is one of the most glorious words in the English language. And in case you didn't fully understand what I'm actually saying there because of the high-pitched squeaking, they are machiculations. And I cannot confirm in any way if these are authentic historical machiculations, which means they are not sealed off underneath. There's actually a hole all the way through to the battlement so the defenders inside can shoot right down. In regards to the Disney castles in the theme parks, they're all sealed off. But is the main Disney castle here? There's no way to tell. Going right up to my castle model, the corbels seem to be placed fairly close together, 30 centimeters gap, but still having a 30 centimeter opening is large enough to be able to shoot down at any attackers. And so I've sealed it off just because it saved me time modeling, and there was no way to tell if they were actually open on the main Disney castle, and so I can't detract or add points, but oh my goodness, if they had authentic machiculations, that would be awesome. There's certainly provision there because of all these corbels and the extended battlements and parapets all around, but like I said, there's just no way to confirm it. The next large defensive weakness with the Disney castle is the size of the internal buildings. See how much higher they are standing above the external walls? Those external walls are usually built to defend the internal buildings. Now, I am not saying that no historical castle had a keep sitting higher above its external walls. Oftentimes there was, but those keeps usually had extensive battlements on them so the defenders could actually man those buildings and shoot down at attackers. It is just that with the Disney castles, there are so many buildings sitting so high above the external walls. The counterpoint to this is that the tallest of buildings are actually sitting much further away from the external walls, and this is where we kind of get the silhouette that fantasy castles usually create. They are lower in elevation on the sides, and as you move in towards the middle, the buildings gradually get bigger. And we kind of see this in certain exceptions regarding historical castles. The further that the internal buildings sit from the external walls also means the further that they will sit away from potential bombardment. If the enemy wants to hit any of the internal buildings, they have to move their siege engines, in a medieval period that would be trebuchets, much closer, which very well could put them in range to the defenders on the external castle walls, which would generally deter the enemy from moving in so close and therefore protect the internal walls. The problem is you can't really destroy trebuchets with arrows. If you want to destroy a trebuchet from a castle, you kind of need a trebuchet yourself that you can fire from the internal bailey of your castle. The problem with the Disney castle is that there is no internal courtyard. They're all filled up with buildings. There's no real room to fit in a defensive counter trebuchet. And so if I was to change anything about the Disney castle to increase its defensibility, I would get rid of most of these internal smaller buildings. I would keep some for the servants, but my goodness, there are heaps there. Definitely enough to fit in some strategically placed defensive trebuchets. And if they were there, that means the enemy would be very reluctant to move in their own trebuchets close enough to hit the internal buildings. They would have to remain at a far enough distance just to hit the external walls, because getting anywhere closer would put them in range of counter-defensive bombardment. And so overall, the Disney castle is pretty darn good. From a defensive point of view, it is 100 times better than Hogwarts defenses, and if you want to know what my views are on Hogwarts as a castle, if it is even a castle, please go watch my video review of Hogwarts. I'll put a link in the description below. But yes, defensively, it is actually a fairly decent castle with only a couple of problems here and there that could be fixed. And then in regards to the other elements that a castle was meant to fulfill, like a statement of power being grand and prestigious, being a royal palace, a center of government, well, the Disney castle fills those roles exceptionally well. This is a beautiful castle. And as I've been able to explain in this video, it's far more historically accurate than you might have realized, and it's pretty good defensively. And so there you go. Thank you for watching, guys. I hope you have enjoyed, and of course, I hope to see you again. If you want to catch any of my future castle-related videos, and anything else related to the medieval period and how it intersects with pop culture, just remember to subscribe to this channel and also click that bell notification so you won't miss a video. I hope to see you there, and until that time, farewell.